In a small, sleepy town surrounded by lush green hills, there lived a woman named Emma Carter. Her life was simple but fulfilling, centered around her cozy little farm nestled at the edge of the community. The farm wasn't large or fancy. It had just enough space for her to grow fresh vegetables, raise chickens, and enjoy the beauty of nature that surrounded her. But what truly made her property special was a grove of ancient oak trees standing tall near the back of her land. These weren't ordinary trees. They were centuries old, their branches reaching skyward like guardians of history. Birds chirped cheerfully among their leaves, squirrels darted up and down their trunks, and during hot summer days, their shade offered relief not only to Emma, but also to anyone passing by. Emma loved everything about these trees. To her, they weren't just plants. They were living, breathing parts of her home. She often sat beneath them with a cup of tea, listening to the rustling leaves as if they were whispering secrets from another time. Sometimes, she'd invite friends over to share stories under the canopy, creating memories that felt timeless. For Emma, the trees symbolized resilience and connection to the earth, to her past, and to the future she hoped to build. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared Emma's appreciation for her wild piece of land. Across the street lived Patricia Hargrove, a woman who took immense pride in being the head of the local homeowners association, HOA. Patricia was known for her sharp tongue and obsession with rules. She believed every lawn should be perfectly manicured, every house painted in neutral tones, and every garden arranged symmetrically. Anything less, in Patricia's opinion, brought down the neighborhood's standards. Patricia had never liked Emma's farm. While most neighbors admired its charm, Patricia saw it as untidy and chaotic. She didn't understand why someone would let their property look so natural. Overgrown bushes, messy vegetable patches, and those towering oaks, how dare they block her view of the sunset? In Patricia's mind, Emma's farm was an eyesore that needed fixing. Despite Patricia's disapproval, Emma paid her no mind. She knew her farm fell outside the HOA's jurisdiction, since it was technically classified as agricultural land. Besides, Emma valued her independence more than pleasing someone like Patricia. What Patricia failed to realize, and what many people didn't know, was that Emma wasn't just a farmer. By day, she tended to her crops and animals, but by night, she worked as an environmental prosecutor. Her job involved taking on big corporations that polluted rivers, destroyed forests, or harmed ecosystems. It was demanding work, but Emma found purpose in protecting the planet. Still, she kept this part of her life private, wanting to keep her world separate. For years, Emma and Patricia coexisted uneasily, their interactions limited to polite nods or frosty glares. But tensions simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over. Little did Emma know, Patricia was growing increasingly frustrated with her inability to control the farm's appearance. And soon, this frustration would lead to a decision that would change both their lives forever. As the seasons passed, Emma continued tending to her trees, oblivious to the storm brewing nearby. The oaks stood strong against the winds of change, unaware of the battle ahead. Meanwhile, Patricia plotted her next move, determined to impose her vision of order, even if it meant crossing lines she shouldn't. The courtroom was quiet as Emma sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight and her expression calm. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a fitting backdrop for the battle about to unfold. Across the aisle, Patricia fidgeted nervously, her usual confidence replaced by visible unease. Her lawyer whispered reassurances, but even he seemed less certain than before. Emma glanced at the judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, and felt a flicker of hope. This was it. After months of preparation, the truth would finally come to light. The trial began with opening statements. Emma's attorney spoke first, laying out the case in clear, measured tones. He described how Patricia had hired loggers without permission, destroyed healthy trees, and violated environmental laws designed to protect natural resources. This isn't just about property damage, he emphasized. It's about accountability for our environment, for our community, and for future generations. Patricia's lawyer countered with a predictable narrative, portraying his client as a concerned neighbor who acted out of safety concerns. He argued that the trees were overgrown and potentially hazardous, suggesting that Patricia had simply been doing what she thought was best for the neighborhood. But his words lacked conviction, especially when faced with the mountain of evidence Emma had gathered. When it came time for testimony, Emma took the stand. Dressed in her professional suit, she spoke with quiet authority, explaining how much the trees meant to her and the ecosystem they supported. She presented photographs of the grove before its destruction, showing its vibrant life and undeniable health. Then she held up images of the aftermath: stumps littering the ground, branches scattered like broken bones. Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted finding the wreckage that cold January morning, but she quickly steadied herself. "Those trees weren't just part of my farm," she said firmly. "They were part of something bigger, a legacy worth protecting." Next came the experts. An arborist testified that the oaks showed no signs of disease or instability, dismissing any claims of hazard. A wildlife biologist explained how the loss of the trees had disrupted local ecosystems, leaving animals displaced and vulnerable. Even a soil scientist weighed in, detailing how the removal of deep-rooted trees increased the risk of erosion and flooding during storms. Each witness chipped away at Patricia's defense until little remained. Patricia took the stand reluctantly, her usual haughty demeanor replaced by defensiveness. Under cross-examination, cracks began to show. When asked why she hadn't sought Emma's consent before hiring loggers, she stammered, claiming she believed the trees were on public land. When questioned about the lack of permits, she shifted blame onto the logging company, insisting they should have handled the paperwork. The more she spoke, the less credible she sounded. By the end of the trial, the verdict seemed almost inevitable. The judge listened intently as closing arguments were made, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she delivered her ruling. Patricia was guilty on all counts. She was ordered to pay substantial fines, serve 200 hours of community service restoring local habitats, and issue a formal apology to Emma and the neighborhood. As the gavel struck, a wave of relief washed over Emma. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for everyone affected by Patricia's actions. For Patricia, however, the fallout was immediate and humiliating. Former allies within the HOA distanced themselves further, unwilling to associate with someone now infamous for her disregard of rules and ethics. Her reputation crumbled, leaving her isolated and bitter. But for Emma, the victory wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. It proved that standing up for what's right, no matter how daunting, could make a difference. As she left the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, asking for comments. Smiling softly, she said, "This case is a reminder that we all share responsibility for protecting our environment. Let's learn from this and do better, for ourselves, for nature, and for the future." With those words, Emma turned and walked away, ready to begin the next chapter of her journey. The days following the destruction of her trees were a blur for Emma. She spent hours poring over legal documents, environmental statutes, and case studies related to deforestation and property rights. Her dining table became a makeshift war room, cluttered with papers, photographs, and highlighted sections of law books. But as she worked, a plan began to take shape, one that would not only hold Patricia accountable, but also send a message to the entire community about the importance of protecting nature. Emma knew she couldn't confront Patricia alone anymore. This was bigger than both of them. It was time to reveal the side of herself she had kept hidden for so long. The next HOA meeting was scheduled in 2 weeks, and Emma decided it would be the perfect stage to unveil her true identity and her intentions. On the day of the meeting, Emma dressed carefully. Instead of her usual jeans and flannel shirt, she wore a sleek navy blue suit, her hair pulled back into a professional bun. She carried a leather briefcase filled with evidence, photos of the destroyed grove, invoices proving Patricia had hired the loggers, expert opinions on the ecological impact of cutting down mature trees, and copies of zoning laws that Patricia had blatantly violated. As she walked into the community center where the meeting was being held, all eyes turned to her. Patricia, seated at the head of the table like a queen surveying her court, raised an eyebrow when she saw Emma. "Well, well," she said with a smirk, clearly amused. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence." Emma ignored the jab and took a seat near the front. When the meeting began, members discussed mundane topics: new paint colors for mailboxes, holiday decorations for the cul-de-sac. But Emma waited patiently for her turn to speak. Finally, as the agenda wound down, she stood up, her posture confident and commanding. "Thank you all for letting me address the group today," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Many of you know me as Emma Carter, your neighbor who runs a small farm on the edge of town. What you may not know is that I'm also an assistant district attorney specializing in environmental law." A murmur rippled through the room. Some neighbors exchanged surprised glances, while others leaned forward, intrigued. Patricia's smirk faltered slightly, though she tried to maintain her composure. "I'm here tonight because something deeply troubling has happened," Emma continued. "Recently, my grove of ancient oak trees that have stood on my property for over a century, were illegally cut down. These trees weren't just part of my land. They supported countless species of wildlife and contributed to our local ecosystem. They were essential to maintaining clean air, preventing soil erosion, and preserving biodiversity." She paused, letting her words sink in before pulling out the receipt signed by Patricia. Holding it up for everyone to see, she added, "This act of destruction wasn't random or accidental. It was orchestrated by someone sitting in this very room, someone who knowingly broke the law and violated ethical boundaries." Patricia's face flushed red, her lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth to protest, but Emma didn't give her the chance. "Let me be clear," Emma said firmly. "This isn't just about me or my property. This is about accountability. If we allow actions like this to go unchecked, what kind of message does that send? That it's okay to destroy nature for personal gain. That rules don't matter if you think you're above them." Her speech struck a nerve. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, whispering among themselves. Even those who had previously sided with Patricia seemed uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, Emma saw cracks forming in Patricia's carefully constructed image of authority. When Emma finished speaking, the room fell silent. Patricia finally spoke up, her tone defensive. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she snapped. "Those trees were hazardous. I did what needed to be done." Emma smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "We'll let the courts decide that," she replied calmly. With that, she gathered her materials and left the room, leaving behind a stunned audience and a furious Patricia. As Emma stepped outside, she felt a surge of determination. Revealing her identity had been risky, but it was necessary. Now, the real battle would begin, not just against Patricia, but for justice and the environment. And Emma was ready to fight. It was a crisp autumn morning when Emma first noticed something unusual. As she stepped out onto her porch with a steaming mug of coffee, she spotted an envelope wedged into the side of her front door. The paper was stiff and official-looking, bearing the logo of the Homeowners Association in bold letters. Emma sighed before she even opened it. She didn't need to guess who had sent it. Patricia Hargrove's signature style was unmistakable. Inside the envelope was a neatly typed letter addressed to Miss Carter. It began politely enough, thanking her for her cooperation in maintaining neighborhood standards, a claim Emma found laughable. But as she read further, the tone shifted. The letter demanded that Emma trim back her tree line immediately, claiming the towering oaks were unsightly and posed a potential hazard due to falling branches. Patricia insisted the trees were overgrown and unkempt, ruining the aesthetic appeal of the area. If Emma failed to comply within 30 days, the letter warned, legal action would be taken. Emma stared at the paper, her brow furrowing. Unsightly. Hazardous. Her trees? She couldn't believe what she was reading. Those oaks had stood tall for over a century, sheltering countless creatures and providing oxygen to the entire community. They weren't just part of her farm. They were part of the ecosystem. How could anyone call them dangerous or ugly? She decided to ignore the letter. After all, her property wasn't under the HOA's jurisdiction, and she knew her trees were healthy. A quick inspection confirmed there were no signs of disease or instability. Sure, a few leaves might fall here and there, but that was hardly a reason to cut them down. Emma figured Patricia would eventually lose interest once she realized nothing was going to change. But Patricia didn't give up easily. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived, this one more forceful than the last. This time, Patricia accused Emma of negligence and threatened fines if the trees weren't trimmed by the deadline. There was even a veiled reference to involving local authorities, though Emma suspected it was an empty threat. Still, the persistence gnawed at her. Why was Patricia so fixated on her trees? Curiosity got the better of Emma, and she decided to do a little digging. She asked around the neighborhood, casually mentioning the letters during conversations. To her surprise, several neighbors admitted they'd received similar complaints about their own yards. One family had been told to remove a wildflower garden because it looked too chaotic. Another homeowner was scolded for leaving a dead tree stump in his backyard. It was home to woodpeckers, but Patricia deemed it unsightly. It seemed Patricia's crusade for perfection knew no bounds. Emma tried reasoning with her directly. On a chilly afternoon, she crossed the street and knocked on Patricia's door. When Patricia answered, she greeted Emma with a tight smile, already bracing for confrontation. Emma calmly explained that her trees were perfectly healthy and played a vital role in supporting wildlife. She pointed out that cutting them down would harm not only her farm, but also the environment. Surely, Patricia could see the bigger picture. Patricia listened with pursed lips, arms crossed over her chest. When Emma finished, she simply shrugged. "I'm sorry, Emma," she said coolly, "but rules are rules. You can't expect everyone else to live with your eccentricities. The trees have to go." Her dismissive attitude left Emma fuming. Eccentricities. Rules. Emma wanted to argue further, but she realized it was pointless. Patricia wasn't interested in compromise or understanding. Her mind was made up, and she wouldn't budge. As Emma walked back to her farm, frustration bubbled inside her. She hated conflict, especially with someone like Patricia, whose stubbornness bordered on obsession. Yet deep down, she refused to let fear dictate her actions. Those trees meant too much to her, to the land, to the animals, to herself. No amount of bullying was going to make her cut them down. Little did Emma know, Patricia was already planning her next move. Ignoring the letters hadn't stopped her before, and now, emboldened by Emma's resistance, she began exploring other options. What neither woman realized was that this clash of wills was about to escalate far beyond anything they could have imagined. For now, though, Emma remained hopeful that common sense, or maybe even compassion, would prevail. But hope, as she would soon learn, could only take you so far. In the weeks that followed her explosive announcement at the HOA meeting, Emma threw herself into building a case against Patricia with the precision and intensity of someone who had spent years prosecuting environmental crimes. This wasn't just personal, it was professional. Every piece of evidence she gathered felt like another step toward justice, not only for her, but for the countless creatures that had lost their home in the grove. Emma began by consulting experts. She reached out to local arborists, ecologists, and wildlife biologists, asking them to assess the damage caused by cutting down the ancient oaks. One arborist confirmed what Emma already knew. The trees were healthy and posed no danger to anyone. In fact, they had been thriving, their roots stabilizing the soil and preventing erosion during heavy rains. Another expert explained how the loss of such mature trees disrupted the local ecosystem, leaving birds, insects, and small mammals without shelter or food sources. "It's like tearing down an entire apartment building," he told her. "You don't just displace one family, you disrupt an entire community." Armed with these expert opinions, Emma turned her attention to legal violations. She discovered that Patricia hadn't obtained the proper permits before hiring the loggers, a clear breach of zoning laws. Furthermore, because the trees were on Emma's property, Patricia's actions constituted trespassing. Emma meticulously documented every detail, organizing the information into a timeline that left no room for doubt about Patricia's guilt. Meanwhile, word of the conflict spread throughout the neighborhood. Some residents admired Emma's courage, seeing her as a champion for both individual rights and environmental protection. Others whispered nervously, unsure whether to side with the underdog farmer or the once untouchable HOA leader. Patricia, however, remained defiant, convinced that her influence within the HOA would shield her from consequences. She even went so far as to tell a few neighbors that Emma was overreacting and trying to make a big deal out of nothing. But Emma wasn't deterred. If anything, Patricia's arrogance only fueled her resolve. She filed formal charges against Patricia for illegal deforestation, trespassing, and violating environmental protection statutes. The case quickly gained traction, drawing attention from local news outlets. Reporters interviewed Emma, snapping photos of her standing amidst the stumps of her beloved trees. Her quiet dignity and unwavering commitment to justice resonated with viewers, turning her into something of a folk hero. Patricia, on the other hand, struggled to maintain her composure as public scrutiny mounted. At first, she dismissed the media coverage as sensationalism, insisting she had acted in the best interest of the neighborhood. But as more details emerged, particularly the damning receipt linking her directly to the logging crew, her confidence began to waver. Friends and allies within the HOA started distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone embroiled in such controversy. Despite the mounting pressure, Patricia refused to back down. Her defense team argued that Emma's lawsuit was motivated by revenge, painting her as a bitter neighbor seeking retribution. They claimed the trees had indeed been hazardous and implied that Emma's emotional attachment to them clouded her judgment. But Emma anticipated this strategy and countered it with irrefutable evidence. She presented photographs showing the trees' health prior to their destruction, along with expert testimony affirming their ecological value. Each argument from Patricia's side crumbled under the weight of facts and logic. As the trial approached, Emma found herself reflecting on the broader implications of the case. This wasn't just about holding Patricia accountable, it was about setting a precedent. If she won, it would send a powerful message that environmental laws mattered, even in small communities. It would remind people that nature wasn't something to be controlled or manipulated for convenience. It was something to be respected and protected. Still, Emma couldn't ignore the toll the fight was taking on her. Late nights poring over documents and strategizing with her legal team left her exhausted. There were moments when doubt crept in. What if she failed? What if Patricia somehow wriggled free of responsibility? But then she'd walk outside the land they had nurtured for generations. By the time the trial date arrived, Emma was ready. She had built a rock-solid case, backed by science, law, and the undeniable truth of what Patricia had done. As she walked into the courtroom, briefcase in hand, she felt a sense of calm determination. No matter the outcome, she knew she had fought for what was right. And sometimes, that was enough. The day started like any other for Emma. A quiet morning filled with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. She brewed herself a cup of tea, fed her chickens, and wandered out to check on her beloved oak trees. But as she stepped outside, something felt off. The air seemed eerily still, devoid of the usual chatter of squirrels and birds. A chill ran down her spine as she followed the path toward the grove. And then she saw it. What had once been a lush, thriving forest of ancient oaks was now a barren wasteland. Dozens of tree trunks lay hacked into jagged stumps, their mighty branches scattered across the ground like broken bones. The vibrant ecosystem that had thrived beneath their shade, birds' nests, insect colonies, mossy patches, was gone. In its place was devastation, raw and unrelenting. Emma's hands trembled as she dropped to her knees, staring in disbelief at the destruction around her. Her heart ached, not just for herself, but for the creatures who had called this grove home. How could someone do this? Who would have the audacity, or cruelty, to destroy something so precious? She didn't need to guess for long. As she scanned the wreckage, her eyes landed on a piece of paper nailed to one of the remaining fence posts. It was a receipt from a local logging company, signed by none other than Patricia Hargrove. Beneath the signature was a note: necessary removal for safety concerns. Emma's blood boiled. Necessary. Safety concerns. Those trees had stood strong through storms, droughts, and decades of change. They were perfectly healthy, their roots deep and their branches sturdy. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. Patricia had crossed a line, and Emma knew exactly who was responsible. Without wasting a moment, Emma grabbed her phone and called the authorities. When the sheriff arrived, she explained everything: the letters, the threats, the blatant disregard for her rights as a landowner. Officers took photos of the damage and collected evidence, including the damning receipt left behind by Patricia. One officer promised to investigate further, though he warned Emma that proving malicious intent might be tricky without concrete proof. That night, unable to sleep, Emma sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the pile of papers spread across the table. There were the HOA letters, the receipt and notes she jotted down during her research on environmental laws. Her mind raced with anger and grief, but also determination. This wasn't just an attack on her property, it was an assault on nature itself, and Emma couldn't let it stand. The next morning, she decided to confront Patricia directly. Crossing the street, she marched up to Patricia's front door and knocked sharply. When Patricia answered, she looked surprised and slightly smug. Before she could say a word, Emma held up the receipt. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage. Patricia blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then, regaining her composure, she straightened her posture and smirked. "Oh, Emma," she said coolly, "I was doing everyone a favor. Those trees were dangerous. Falling branches could have hurt someone." "Dangerous?" Emma shot back. "They were fine. You cut them down because you don't like how they look. Admit it." Patricia waved a dismissive hand. "Call it what you want. The point is, the neighborhood is better off without them. You'll see." Emma clenched her fists, resisting the urge to scream. Arguing with Patricia was futile. The woman was impossible to reason with. But as Emma turned to leave, she made a silent vow. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Patricia might think she'd won, but Emma had resources and knowledge that Patricia couldn't even begin to comprehend. For now, Emma returned to her farm, her heart heavy with loss but burning with resolve. She began documenting every detail of the destruction, snapping photos of the stumps and gathering statements from neighbors who had witnessed Patricia's obsessive behavior. Each piece of evidence fueled her determination to hold Patricia accountable. What Patricia didn't realize was that she hadn't just destroyed trees, she had awakened a fighter. Emma Carter wasn't just a farmer trying to protect her land. She was an environmental prosecutor, well-versed in the laws designed to safeguard nature. And soon, Patricia would learn the hard way that crossing Emma wasn't just a personal affront. It was a legal misstep she'd deeply regret. As the sun set over the ruined grove, casting long shadows across the scared earth, Emma whispered a promise to the fallen trees. "This isn't the end," she said softly. "Not for you, and not for me." Months had passed since the trial, and life in the small town began to settle into a new rhythm. The scars of the past were still visible, both on Emma's farm and within the community, but healing was underway. The saplings Emma and her neighbors had planted now stood a little taller, their leaves reaching toward the sun with quiet determination. Birds chirped cheerfully among the branches, and the air buzzed with the hum of bees, drawn to the wildflowers blooming nearby. Slowly but surely, the land was coming back to life. Emma found comfort in these small signs of renewal. Every morning, she walked through the grove, checking on the progress of each young tree. She marveled at how quickly they adapted, their roots digging deep into the soil as if claiming it as their own. It reminded her of resilience, not just of nature, but of people too. The way her neighbors had come together after everything that happened showed her that communities could grow stronger when faced with adversity. They weren't just rebuilding trees. They were rebuilding trust, connection, and hope. Word of Emma's efforts spread beyond the town, inspiring others to take action in their own corners of the world. Schools invited her to speak about environmental stewardship, and local organizations asked for her guidance on sustainable practices. At first, Emma hesitated, unsure if she wanted to step into such a public role. But as she saw the impact her words had on others, young students planting their first tree or families starting backyard gardens, she realized her story wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about possibility. If one person could make a difference, then anyone could. Patricia's absence lingered in subtle ways. Her perfectly manicured lawn and pristine flower beds no longer set the standard for neighborhood aesthetics. Instead, residents embraced a more natural beauty. Untamed hedges, wildflower patches, and vegetable gardens bursting with color. Even the HOA meetings became less formal, with discussions focusing on practical solutions rather than rigid rules. Without Patricia's iron grip, the community discovered a newfound freedom to express themselves while still respecting shared spaces. For Emma, this shift marked a turning point. She no longer felt like an outsider battling against impossible odds. Instead, she saw herself as part of something larger, a collective effort to create balance between human needs and the environment. And though she never sought recognition, she couldn't deny the pride she felt when neighbors thanked her for standing up to Patricia. Some even admitted they wished they'd spoken out sooner, realizing now how much power silence could give to those who abused it. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emma hosted a small gathering at her farm to celebrate the progress they'd made. Neighbors brought dishes to share, laughter filled the air, and children played tag among the rows of young trees. As Emma looked around at the smiling faces, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the support she'd received, but for the lessons she'd learned along the way. This journey had taught her that change didn't happen overnight, but with persistence and unity, it was possible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the grove, Emma addressed the group. "I want to thank all of you," she began, her voice warm and steady. "Not just for helping me replant these trees, but for reminding me what it means to be a community. We've been through a lot together, and I know we'll face challenges ahead. But if we keep working side by side, there's nothing we can't overcome." Her words earned a round of applause, followed by cheers and hugs. For the first time in years, Emma felt truly at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she knew imperfection was part of growth. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she trusted that as long as they stayed connected to each other and to the land, they would find their way. Later that night, as Emma sat alone beneath the stars, she reflected on how far she'd come. From the devastation of losing her trees to the triumph of holding Patricia accountable, every moment had shaped her into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. She thought about the future, the decades it would take for the saplings to mature into towering giants, and smiled. By then, she might not be around to see it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was knowing she had planted the seeds of something enduring. The wind rustled softly through the leaves above, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. Emma closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. In that moment, she knew the fight hadn't ended. It had evolved. It was no longer about resistance or retribution. It was about restoration, resilience, and renewal. And as long as she lived, she would dedicate herself to nurturing all three, for her farm, for her community, and for the aftermath of the trial brought a mix of emotions for Emma. On one hand, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served. Patricia's actions hadn't gone unpunished, and the ruling sent a clear message to the community. Nature mattered, and no one was above the law. But on the other hand, Emma couldn't shake the lingering sadness over the loss of her beloved trees. No amount of legal victory could bring them back or undo the harm done to the ecosystem they once supported. Still, Emma refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she channeled her energy into something positive: rebuilding. With the help of neighbors who had rallied behind her during the trial, Emma organized a tree planting event on her property. Flyers went up around town, inviting everyone to participate in restoring the grove. To her surprise, dozens of people showed up, not just neighbors but also local students, environmental activists, and even a few former HOA members who admitted they'd underestimated the importance of conservation. On a bright spring morning, volunteers gathered at Emma's farm, armed with shovels, seedlings, and determination. The air buzzed with conversation as people worked together, planting saplings of native oak, maple, and birch trees. Children ran between rows, scattering wildflower seeds to attract pollinators. Someone brought a boombox, filling the space with cheerful music. For the first time in months, laughter echoed across Emma's land instead of silence. As Emma moved among the volunteers, handing out water bottles and offering guidance, she felt a renewed sense of hope. These tiny saplings weren't replacements for the ancient oaks she had lost. They never could be. But they represented resilience. They were a promise to the future, a way of saying that life would find a way to thrive again if given the chance. Patricia, meanwhile, struggled to adjust to her new reality. The court's decision had stripped her of not only her pride, but also her influence within the neighborhood. Her forced apology, delivered stiffly at the next HOA meeting, did little to win back allies. Many residents openly mocked her behind her back, while others simply ignored her altogether. She tried to reclaim some semblance of control by micromanaging minor details, like insisting on standardized flower arrangements for the upcoming block party, but even those efforts fell flat. Without her usual authority, Patricia seemed diminished, almost pitiful. Eventually, unable to bear the weight of her tarnished reputation, Patricia put her house on the market and quietly moved away. Some speculated she relocated to another state. Others didn't care enough to ask. Either way, her departure marked the end of an era. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, grateful for the return of peace, and for Emma, the unlikely hero who had stood up to tyranny. In the weeks that followed, Emma noticed subtle changes in the community. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now exchanged friendly waves and stopped for chats. People began taking greater pride in their surroundings, planting gardens, installing birdhouses, and organizing cleanup drives. It was as though Patricia's downfall had freed them from the pressure of perfection, allowing them to embrace imperfection and each other in meaningful ways. For Emma, the transformation was bittersweet. While she was glad to see her neighbors coming together, she sometimes missed the solitude of her old life. Before the trial, her days had been simple, tending to her farm, enjoying quiet moments beneath the oaks, and finding joy in small pleasures. Now she found herself thrust into the spotlight, hailed as a champion for both individual rights and environmental protection. Strangers approached her at the farmers' market to thank her for inspiring change. Local schools invited her to speak about sustainability and advocacy. Even reporters occasionally called, asking for updates on her green renaissance. At first, the attention overwhelmed her. But over time, Emma learned to accept it as part of her journey. She realized that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And while she still preferred the quiet comforts of her farm, she embraced her role as a voice for change, using her platform to educate and empower others. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma walked through the newly planted grove. The saplings swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves catching the last golden rays of light. Though they were small and fragile now, she imagined them growing tall and strong, shading the land once more. Someday, Birds would nest in their branches, squirrels would scamper along their trunks, and children would play beneath their canopies. Life would circle back to where it began, stronger than before.